Berlin, March 1945. A Wehrmacht corporal crouched behind shattered masonry, reloading with shaking hands. His report would later read, enemy soldier firing 2 automatic weapons simultaneously. Rate of fire impossible for single human operator. Entire squad eliminated in 4 seconds. But the American firing at him wasn't holding 2 guns. He was holding one weapon the Germans would come to fear more than flamethrowers, more than grenades, more than close air support. A weapon so brutal, so overwhelming in its violence, that survivors refused to believe what they'd seen. The Twin-Barrel Thompson submachine gun. And the men who carried it into the burning streets of Europe's last cities learned one truth faster than any other. Some weapons don't just kill the enemy. They kill the man firing them too. The problem started in Aachen, October 1944. American infantry had entered Germany's first city, and the Wehrmacht wasn't retreating. They were dug into every building, every cellar, every stairwell. Standard infantry tactics fell apart. You couldn't call artillery on a building when your own men were 3 floors below the enemy. You couldn't use tanks in streets so narrow their turrets couldn't traverse. And the Thompson submachine gun, reliable as it was, carried one fatal limitation in urban warfare: 45 rounds per minute. Excellent for suppressing a position, inadequate for clearing a room filled with desperate men who knew they were already dead. Lieutenant Colonel Simon Webb understood firepower. He'd commanded a rifle company through Normandy, through the hedgerows, through the nightmare of Hürtgen Forest. But street fighting was different. In the bocage, you could maneuver. In a city, there was no flanking, no cover, just straight-ahead violence, room after room, until one side stopped moving. Webb had watched 3 men die clearing a single apartment in Aachen. They'd entered with Thompsons, fired, reloaded, and in that 2-second gap, a German potato masher grenade had bounced down the hallway. All 3 Americans died before the enemy soldier even showed himself. Webb sat in a ruined bakery that night, surrounded by maps and spent shell casings, and asked a question that would change infantry combat. What if you didn't have to reload? What if you could deliver twice the rounds in the same time, with the same weapon system, without stopping? The idea wasn't new. The Soviets had experimented with dual-mounted rifles. The Germans had created twin MG, 42 mounts for defensive positions. But nobody had attempted it with a submachine gun. Nobody had tried to give a single soldier, on foot, in close quarters, the firepower of 2 men. The concept reached the Springfield Armory Engineering Section in November 1944. Captain James Riverton, a weapons designer who'd worked on the M1 Garand improvements, read Webb's proposal and immediately saw 3 problems. First, recoil. A single Thompson kicked hard enough that untrained soldiers often pulled left on full auto. 2 Thompsons firing simultaneously would generate forces that could break a man's collarbone. Second, weight. 1 Thompson weighed 10.5 pounds. 2, plus the mounting frame, plus double ammunition, would exceed 30 pounds. No infantryman could carry that and still fight. Third, mechanical synchronization. If the 2 barrels didn't fire in perfect unison, the weapon would tear itself apart. Riverton didn't dismiss the idea. He refined it. Instead of mounting 2 complete Thompson systems side by side, he proposed a single receiver feeding 2 barrels from a shared ammunition system. The bolts would operate on a linked mechanism, ensuring simultaneous firing. The stock would be reinforced with steel plating to absorb recoil, and the entire assembly would use a modified 100-round drum magazine, split internally to feed both barrels. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it would require metallurgy and machining precision that barely existed in 1944. The first prototype was assembled in a Massachusetts workshop on December 9, 1944. Riverton and 2 machinists worked 16-hour days, handcrafting parts that couldn't be ordered from standard supply. The dual-barrel assembly required perfect alignment. If 1 barrel sat even a millimeter off axis, the weapon would jam, or, worse, explode. The feeding mechanism had to split the ammunition flow without causing misfires, and the recoil system needed to distribute force evenly, or the shooter would lose control after the first burst. They test-fired it on December 18th. The weapon was mounted on a static frame, aimed at a dirt berm, loaded with 20 rounds. Riverton pulled the trigger. The sound wasn't a stutter. It was a roar. Both barrels fired in unison, spitting brass in twin arcs. Stitching the berm with holes so close together, they formed a single ragged line. The frame shook violently. Bolts rattled loose. But it worked. For 3 seconds, the Twin-Barrel Thompson delivered firepower no single infantryman had ever controlled. Then the feed mechanism jammed, the right barrel overheated, and the entire assembly seized. Riverton didn't celebrate. He tore the weapon down, identified 14 points of failure, and started again. The second prototype was heavier, reinforced at every stress point, with an improved feed ramp and upgraded barrel cooling. The third prototype added a forward grip and shoulder brace. The fourth used a different firing synchronization mechanism. By January 1945, they had a weapon that could fire 50 rounds without catastrophic failure. It weighed 28 pounds fully loaded. It kicked like an angry mule, but it worked. The Army tested it at Fort Benning in late January. Infantry instructors fired it at man-sized targets from 10, 20, and 30 yards. The results were devastating. At 10 yards, a 2-second burst obliterated the target completely. At 20 yards, it punched a cluster of holes through the chest area that no human could survive. At 30 yards, recoil control became difficult, but the sheer volume of fire compensated for accuracy loss. One instructor, a veteran of the Pacific Campaign, fired it once and said, "If I'd had this on Peleliu, we have cleared that island in half the time." But there were problems. The weapon overheated after 60 rounds. The barrels glowed red-hot, warping slightly, which affected accuracy in sustained use. The recoil was manageable for a large, strong soldier, but smaller men couldn't control it, and the ammunition consumption was catastrophic. A standard infantryman carried 210 rounds for a Thompson. With the twin barrel, that magazine was empty in under 2 minutes of combat. Logistics officers calculated that supplying a single twin-barrel Thompson required 3 times the ammunition of a standard weapon. In a protracted firefight, the soldier would run dry long before the enemy. Despite these limitations, the Army approved limited field testing. 6 twin-barrel Thompsons were shipped to the European theater in February 1945, distributed to units engaged in urban combat. The 1st Infantry Division received 2. The 9th Infantry Division received 2. The 3rd Armored Division received 2 for their mechanized infantry. Each weapon came with a 2-page instruction manual, a warning about barrel heat, and a note from Riverton. This weapon is experimental. It will not behave like a standard Thompson. Treat it with caution and respect. Sergeant Carl Dietrich, 1st Infantry Division, received his twin-barrel Thompson on February 22, 1945, outside the German town of Düren. He'd been a rifleman since Omaha Beach, carried a Garand through France, and switched to a Thompson for urban fighting in Aachen. He was 24 years old, 6 feet tall, 205 pounds of Kansas farm muscle. When they handed him the twin barrel, he looked at it for 5 seconds and said, "What the hell am I supposed to do with this?" His lieutenant explained, room clearing, close quarter suppression, overwhelming firepower in confined spaces. Dietrich hefted the weapon, felt its weight, and understood immediately that this wasn't a tool for long patrols or defensive positions. This was a breaching weapon, a shock weapon, a gun you fired once hard and hoped the enemy didn't get back up. He test-fired it in a ruined factory courtyard, aiming at a brick wall 30 feet away. He braced, thumbed the selector to full auto, and squeezed. The weapon erupted. The sound was monstrous, a chainsaw tearing through steel. Brass flew in double streams. The wall disintegrated under the impact, bricks shattering, mortar dust exploding outward. Dietrich's shoulder absorbed the recoil, his arms shaking from the vibration. He fired for 3 seconds. When he released the trigger, his ears were ringing, his hands were numb, and the wall had a hole the size of a manhole cover. His squad mates stared. One of them, a corporal from Ohio, whispered, "Jesus Christ, Carl. That thing's not a gun. That's a goddamn apocalypse." Dietrich used it for the first time in combat on February 26, during the assault on a fortified German command post in Düren. The building was a 3-story stone structure, windows bricked up, entrance barricaded with furniture and sandbags. Intelligence reported at least 12 Wehrmacht soldiers inside, with MG-42 nests covering the approaches. Standard procedure would have been to call in tank support or artillery. But the building sat between 2 occupied civilian shelters. Shelling risked collateral casualties. So the order came down, clear by hand. Dietrich's squad stacked outside the entrance. Explosives breached the door. Smoke, grenades went in first. Then Dietrich stepped through, Twin-Barrel Thompson leveled. The interior was dark, thick with smoke and plastered dust. He saw movement, shadows shifting behind overturned desks. He didn't aim. He just fired. The twin barrels roared in the confined space. The sound deafening, overwhelming, a physical force that pressed against the walls. Bullets shredded furniture, punched through wood and flesh, ricocheted off stone. Dietrich swept left to right, holding the trigger down, feeling the weapon fight him, feeling the heat radiating from the barrels. Spent casings rained onto the floor in a metallic torrent. The smoke thickened, and then, abruptly, the magazine was empty. He stepped back, breathing hard, ears useless. The silence after the firing eerie and unnatural. His squad mates moved past him, clearing corners, checking bodies. 7 Germans lay dead in the first room alone. None had returned fire. They hadn't had time. The Twin-Barrel Thompson had ended the fight before it started. But Dietrich's hands were shaking, not from fear, from the weapon itself. The recoil had bruised his shoulder. The heat from the barrels had singed the front grip, and the ammunition expenditure had been total. 100 rounds gone in 8 seconds. If there had been another room, another enemy, he'd have been defenseless. His lieutenant found him reloading outside, hands still trembling. How to perform? Dietrich looked at the weapon, then at the shattered building. It performs, but it's not sustainable. I go through ammo faster than I can carry it. And if I fire more than 2 magazines in a row, the barrels warp. This thing's a monster, sir, but it's a monster that eats itself. The after-action report reached division headquarters the next day. Effective, devastating in close quarters, unsustainable for prolonged engagement, recommended for shock assaults only, not suitable as standard infantry weapon. The same pattern repeated across other units. The 9th Infantry used their twin barrels in Rheinberg, clearing bunkers along the Rhine. The 3rd Armored used theirs in urban ambush scenarios. Every report said the same thing. The weapon worked exactly as designed. It delivered overwhelming firepower. It terrified the enemy, and it couldn't be used for more than a few minutes before becoming a liability. But the psychological impact was undeniable. German soldiers who survived encounters with the Twin-Barrel Thompson described it in their reports with a kind of horrified awe. One Wehrmacht lieutenant, captured after a firefight in Wesel, was interrogated about American weapons. When asked about the double gun, he stiffened. We called it Doppeltod. Double death. You hear it once. You know you're already gone. The sound is wrong. Too fast. Too loud. Like the air is being torn apart. We had men refuse to enter buildings if they knew the Americans had that weapon. It wasn't cowardice. It was logic. You can't fight what you can't survive. Another report, captured from a German medical unit, described treating a soldier who'd been in a room when a Twin-Barrel Thompson opened fire. He wasn't hit, but the sound and concussion had ruptured his eardrums and caused temporary paralysis from shock. The medic wrote, psychological trauma consistent with close artillery impact. Patient states American soldier fired 2 weapons simultaneously. This is impossible, but patient insists description is accurate. The Allies never corrected the misunderstanding. If the Germans want to believe American soldiers were dual-wielding submachine guns, let them believe it. Fear was a weapon too. Dietrich carried his twin barrel through March, using it 3 more times. Once in Remagen, clearing a warehouse. Once in Limburg, breaching a fortified inn. Once in Hadamar, suppressing a counterattack in a train station. Each time, the results were the same. Absolute dominance for the first 10 seconds. Then frantic reloading, scorched hands, and a nagging awareness that he just burned through ammunition faster than a heavy machine gun crew. On March 29th, during the push toward Frankfurt, the weapon finally failed. Dietrich was clearing a municipal building when he encountered a German rearguard squad entrenched in a stairwell. He fired a full magazine, both barrels roaring, the staircase filling with smoke and noise and death. The Germans broke, retreating upward. Dietrich reloaded, pursued, fired again, and halfway through the second magazine, the right barrel cracked. The metal, stressed by repeated overheating and rapid cooling, split along a hairline fracture. The weapon didn't explode. It just stopped working. Dietrich stared at the broken barrel, still hot enough to blister skin, and realized something the engineers hadn't accounted for. You couldn't make a weapon this violent and expect it to last. Physics didn't allow it. Metallurgy didn't allow it. The Twin-Barrel Thompson was a brilliant idea that consumed itself in the execution. It could dominate a single engagement. But war wasn't a single engagement. It was day after day, fight after fight, until the tools he relied on either held together or fell apart. He carried the broken weapon back to the rear, traded it for a standard Thompson, and never requested another twin-barrel. When his lieutenant asked why, Dietrich said, "Because I want a gun that's still working when the third wave hits. That thing is a sledgehammer. But sometimes you need a scalpel." By April, the Twin-Barrel Thompson program was quietly shelved. Of the 6 weapons deployed, 3 had catastrophic mechanical failures. 2 were lost in combat. 1 remained functional but was pulled from service due to logistical concerns. The final report, filed in May 1945, concluded, "Weapon demonstrates exceptional tactical effectiveness in close-quarters battle. However, reliability, sustainability, and logistical support requirements make it unsuitable for general infantry use. Recommend design principles be retained for future urban warfare weapon development. Do not recommend mass production." The Twin-Barrel Thompson never saw official adoption. The few remaining examples were returned to Springfield Armory, studied, disassembled, and stored. Riverton's design notes were archived. The metallurgical data was analyzed for future projects. But the weapon itself vanished from the battlefield as quickly as it had appeared. Yet its legacy lingered. Soldiers who fought alongside Dietrich and others who carried the weapon told stories, exaggerated stories. Stories about Americans walking into German strongpoints with guns that sounded like aircraft cannons. Stories about entire squads annihilated in seconds by a single man. Stories that grew with each retelling, until the Twin-Barrel Thompson became myth as much as machine. Decades later, military historians would debate its significance. Some dismissed it as a wartime experiment, a dead-end design born from desperation and overambition. Others argued it represented a crucial moment in infantry weapon evolution, a recognition that urban combat demanded different tools, different thinking, different levels of violence. The Twin-Barrel Thompson didn't succeed as a weapon system, but it succeeded as an idea that sometimes overwhelming firepower in a critical moment could decide a battle faster than tactics, faster than training, faster than courage. Dietrich survived the war. He returned to Kansas, worked his family's farm, raised 3 children, and rarely spoke about his time in Europe. But once, in 1963, during a 4th of July barbecue, his youngest son asked him what the scariest weapon he'd ever used was. Dietrich paused, spatula in hand, staring at nothing. The Twin-Barrel Thompson, he said finally, scared the hell out of the Germans. Scared the hell out of me, too. Because when you're holding something that powerful, you start wondering if you're controlling the weapon or if it's controlling you. And in a fight, that hesitation can kill you faster than the enemy. His son didn't understand, but his wife did. She'd seen the scars on his shoulder, the burn marks on his palms, the way he sometimes flinched at sudden loud noises. The Twin-Barrel Thompson hadn't just been a weapon. It had been a test of strength, of will, of how much violence a single human being could channel before it changed them. The weapon story became a footnote in military history, a curiosity, an oddity mentioned briefly in books about experimental firearms and forgotten innovations. But the soldiers who encountered it, on either side, never forgot. They remembered the sound, the fury, The absolute, uncompromising lethality of a weapon designed not to wound or suppress, but to annihilate. The Germans called it double death. The Americans called it the Twin Thompson. Riverton called it his proudest failure. And Dietrich, alone in his Kansas fields decades later, called it the closest thing to holding thunder in your hands. Because in the end, that's what it was. A storm compressed into steel and wood, unleashed in rooms too small to contain its violence, carried by men too stubborn to acknowledge its cost. It was everything warfare demanded and everything humanity couldn't sustain. It was brilliant and brutal and ultimately impossible. And for a few short weeks in the dying days of World War II, it was real. The lesson wasn't about firepower. Every army understood firepower. The lesson was about limits, about the point where increasing lethality stopped being an advantage and started being a burden, about recognizing that the perfect weapon for one moment might be the worst weapon for the next, about understanding that war isn't won by the gun that fires the most rounds, but by the gun that's still working when the shooting stops. The Twin-Barrel Thompson fired faster, hit harder, and dominated more completely than any submachine gun ever created. But it couldn't last. And in warfare, what can't last eventually disappears, no matter how devastating it was while it existed. Urban combat would continue to evolve. Future weapons would learn from the Twin-Barrel's successes and failures. They'd balance firepower with sustainability, lethality with reliability, shock with endurance. But they'd never quite replicate the raw, terrifying presence of a single soldier stepping into a smoke-filled room with two barrels roaring in perfect unison, delivering death faster than the enemy could process what was happening. That moment, that weapon, that sound belonged to 1945 alone. It couldn't be repeated, shouldn't be repeated. But it had to exist, if only to prove what was possible when desperation met ingenuity, when engineers stopped asking if they should and started asking if they could. They could. They did. And the men who carried that weapon into battle paid the price for that knowledge with bruised shoulders, scorched hands, and the understanding that some tools are too powerful for the wars we fight. The Twin-Barrel Thompson was retired, archived, forgotten by everyone except the men who'd heard its roar echoing through rubble-choked streets in the final months of the European War. And sometimes late at night, when the wind blew hard across the Kansas plains, Carl Dietrich would wake from a dream where he was young again, standing in a smoke-filled room, holding a weapon that sounded like the end of the world. He'd sit up, breathe slowly, and remind himself it was over. The war was over. The weapon was gone. The sound existed only in memory. But memory was enough. Memory kept the lesson alive. And the lesson was this: violence has a limit. Push past that limit, and you don't become more effective. You become something else. Something that wins the battle but loses the war within yourself. The Twin-Barrel Thompson taught that lesson to everyone who touched it. And in the end, that was its greatest contribution. Not the Germans it killed, but the warning it delivered to the men who carried it. Some weapons are too much. Some fires burn too hot. And some innovations, no matter how brilliant, should remain experiments. Cautionary tales etched into history as reminders that progress and destruction are not the same thing. The archive records don't tell the full story. They never do. What they don't show is the night before Dietrich first carried the Twin-Barrel into combat, when he sat in a foxhole outside during with his squad, passing around a canteen of watered-down coffee, and one of the replacement soldiers, a kid from Maine barely 19 years old, asked him what the new gun was like. Dietrich had cleaned the weapon 3 times that day, checked the feed mechanism, tested the trigger pull, memorized the reload sequence. But he hadn't answered the fundamental question the kid was really asking. Will it keep me alive? It's loud, Dietrich said finally, louder than anything you've heard, and it's fast. So fast you'll think it jammed after the first burst, because your brain can't process that much firing happening at once. The enemy won't have time to think either. That's the point. The kid nodded, trying to look confident, but his hands were shaking. They all shook before urban combat. Dietrich's had 2, back in Aachen, before he'd learned that fear was just your body preparing for violence. The shaking stopped once the shooting started. It always did. But here's what they don't tell you, Dietrich continued, his voice lower now, so only the kid could hear. A weapon like that changes a fight. It changes how you think. You start relying on it. You start believing that firepower solves everything. And the moment you believe that, you stop being careful. You stop thinking. And that's when you die. The kid didn't fully understand. How could he? He hadn't yet learned that war was less about courage and more about caution. Less about heroism and more about staying alive long enough to make the right decision at the right time. The Twin-Barrel Thompson was the opposite of caution. It was aggression distilled into mechanical form. And aggression, unchecked, got men killed. The next morning, after Dietrich had used the weapon for the first time, after he'd cleared that command post and watched 7 men die in 8 seconds, the kid from Maine approached him again. Dietrich was sitting on a pile of rubble, hands still shaking, ears still ringing, the Twin-Barrel Thompson resting across his knees. "Sergeant," the kid said quietly, How you keep doing this?" Dietrich looked at him, really looked at him, saw the fear, the exhaustion, the desperate need for an answer that made sense. And he realized there wasn't one. You didn't keep doing this. You just did it one moment after another until either the war ended or you did. You don't think about the weapon, Dietrich said. You think about the guy next to you. You think about getting him home. You think about making sure that when the door opens and hell is on the other side, you're the one who steps through first. Not because you're braver, because you're the one holding the biggest gun. It wasn't a good answer, but it was an honest one. And in March 1945, honesty was the only currency that still had value. The Twin-Barrel Thompson's impact extended beyond the soldiers who carried it. Ordnance officers struggled to supply adequate ammunition. Each twin barrel in the field consumed as much .45 ACP as 3 standard Thompsons. Supply chains already stretched thin across occupied Germany now had to account for weapons that burned through magazines faster than loaders could replenish them. Quartermasters filed complaints. Logistics coordinators requested reassignment. And still the weapon stayed in service, because the infantrymen who carried them into buildings filled with desperate, dying Germans refused to give them up. Captain Riverton, back at Springfield Armory, received field reports daily. He read them with a mixture of pride and concern. Pride because his design worked. Concern because it worked too well. He created a weapon that soldiers loved and hated in equal measure. Love for its power, hated for its cost. And cost wasn't just measured in ammunition. One report, dated March 15, 1945, described an incident in Koblenz. A corporal with the 9th Infantry Division had carried a Twin-Barrel Thompson into a fortified wine cellar, where a German machine gun nest was dug in. He'd fired both barrels simultaneously, clearing position in seconds. But the confined space, the stone walls, the acoustic amplification had been so extreme that the concussive force ruptured blood vessels in his nose and ears. He survived. The Germans didn't. But the corporal was medically evacuated for hearing loss and never returned to combat. Riverton read that report 3 times. Then he wrote a memo to his superiors. "We have created a weapon that harms the operator almost as much as the enemy. Recommend immediate review of deployment protocols." The memo was filed. Not ignored, but filed, because in March 1945, the war was ending. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was in a bunker, and the Allied command had bigger concerns than experimental submachine guns that worked too well. The Twin-Barrel Thompson could be a problem for peacetime analysis. Right now it was a tool, and tools were used until they broke or the job was done. Dietrich used his weapon one final time on April 2nd, in a town whose name he never learned, against an enemy he never saw clearly. His squad was advancing through a residential district when machine gun fire erupted from a second-story window. Standard response would have been to pull back, call for armor, suppress, and flank. But Dietrich saw the muzzle flash, saw the angle, and knew there wasn't time. His squad mates were exposed. The machine gun would cut them down in seconds. He sprinted forward, alone, against every tactical principle drilled into him since basic training. He hit the building's entrance, kicked through the door, and charged up the stairs. The German machine gunner heard him coming, tried to swing the MG-42 around. Didn't make it. Dietrich fired from the hip, both barrels erupting, the stairwell filling with sound and fury. The machine gunner died instantly. The loader behind him died instantly. The ammunition boxes exploded, and the Twin-Barrel Thompson, stressed beyond its design limits, finally broke. The right barrel cracked with sound like a rifle shot. Metal stress, thermal expansion, metallurgical failure. The weapon didn't explode. It simply stopped being a weapon. Dietrich stood there, breathing hard, holding a broken gun, surrounded by bodies and spent brass and the bitter smell of cordite, and felt something inside him break too. Not his nerve, not his courage. Something else. The part of him that had believed, even unconsciously, that superior firepower made you invincible. The Twin-Barrel Thompson had kept him alive, but it couldn't keep him whole. And standing in that stairwell, holding a gun that had finally given out, he understood that every weapon had a breaking point, including the men who carried them. He walked back down the stairs, past his squad mates who were staring at him like he'd done something impossible. Maybe he had. Maybe charging a machine gun nest alone with a Twin-Barrel Thompson was impossible. But impossible was just another word for desperate. And desperation had been the baseline emotion since Normandy. His lieutenant took one look at the broken weapon and said, "Get a standard Thompson from supply." Dietrich nodded, handed over the twin-barrel, walked away and didn't look back. He carried a standard Thompson for the rest of the war. 20 more days, 16 more firefights, 3 more German towns. And when the shooting finally stopped, when the Wehrmacht surrendered and the war in Europe ended, he sat in a displaced persons camp in Bavaria and realized he couldn't remember the faces of the men he'd killed. Just the sound of the Twin-Barrel Thompson roaring in enclosed spaces. That sound had drowned out everything else. Years later, military analysts would study the Twin-Barrel Thompson as a case study in weapon development. They'd examine the metallurgy, the feeding mechanism, the recoil compensation. They'd build mathematical models of its performance. They'd compare to later designs, to modern submachine guns, to current close-quarters battle weapons. And they conclude that it was a dead-end design, impractical, unsustainable, a product of wartime desperation rather than sound engineering. But they'd be wrong, because the Twin-Barrel Thompson wasn't a failure. It was a boundary test, a way of finding the absolute limit of what one soldier could deliver in close combat before physics, logistics, and human endurance said no. And that limit was important, not because you wanted to reach it every time, but because you needed to know where it was. Modern Special Forces doctrine talks about violence of action, about overwhelming the enemy so completely, so quickly, that resistance becomes impossible. The Twin-Barrel Thompson embodied that principle 60 years before it had a name. It proved that shock could end a fight faster than tactics, that psychological dominance could be as lethal as bullets, that sometimes the sound of a weapon mattered as much as its accuracy. But it also proved that shock had a cost, that overwhelming firepower required overwhelming support, that you couldn't sustain maximum violence indefinitely. That war, ultimately, was an endurance contest, and the weapons that won wars weren't the most powerful. They were the ones that kept working. Dietrich understood that instinctively. He'd carried the most powerful close-quarters weapon of World War II, and he'd chosen to put it down, not because it didn't work, because it worked too well, because it demanded too much, because war wasn't about winning one engagement with maximum violence. It was about surviving 1,000 engagements with sustainable violence. The Twin-Barrel Thompson fired twice as many rounds, but a standard Thompson fired long enough to matter. And in April 1945, as Germany collapsed and victory became inevitable, lasting mattered more than dominating. The weapon disappeared into history. The men who carried it returned home, aged, died, and took their stories with them. The engineering diagrams were archived. The prototypes were decommissioned. And the only evidence that the Twin-Barrel Thompson had ever existed came from German after-action reports, filled with descriptions of impossible firepower and weapons that defied belief. Double death, they'd called it, and they'd been right. Not because it killed twice as effectively, because it was death delivered with such speed, such finality, that the mind couldn't process what was happening. You heard it, and then you were gone. That was the weapon's true legacy, not its mechanical specifications or its tactical performance. Its legacy was psychological. It changed how soldiers thought about firepower. It proved that infantry weapons could be as devastating as crew serve systems if you were willing to accept the costs. And it reminded everyone who studied it that innovation wasn't about pushing boundaries just because you could. It was about knowing when to push and when to hold back. The Twin-Barrel Thompson pushed. It pushed metallurgy. It pushed ergonomics. It pushed logistics. It pushed the men who carried it. And in pushing, it found the edge. The exact point where more became too much. That edge still exists. Modern weapons designers still search for it, testing new materials, new mechanisms, new ways to deliver more lethality with less weight. They'll never stop searching, because warfare demands it, because enemies adapt, because the side with the better tools usually wins. But every designer who studies the Twin-Barrel Thompson learns the same lesson Dietrich learned in that German stairwell. Power without sustainability is just noise. Domination without endurance is just a moment. And the weapon that wins wars isn't the one that fires the most rounds in 10 seconds. It's the one that still fires after 10 hours, 10 days, 10 weeks. The Twin-Barrel Thompson fired brilliantly. For a few weeks in early 1945, it was the most feared close-quarters weapon on the Western Front. German soldiers broke and ran when they heard it. American soldiers fought over who got to carry it. And then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. But its echo remains. In doctrine, in design philosophy, in the understanding that warfare sometimes demands weapons at the absolute edge of what's possible, and in the stories told by the few surviving men who carried it, who felt its recoil, who heard it impossible roar, and who walked away knowing they'd held something that should never have existed, but had to exist, if only to prove what could be done when desperation met brilliance in the crucible of war. That's the story of the Twin-Barrel Thompson. Not a success story, not a failure story, a boundary story, a line drawn in history that said, this far and no further, at least not in 1945. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most fascinating forgotten weapons, subscribe now for more untold stories from history's battlefield innovations. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below.